September 7, 1940. Waterloo Station, London. 6:47 p.m. The screech of metal on metal cut through the evening air as the locomotive ground to a halt. Steam hissed from the valves like labored breathing, curling upward through the amber light filtering through the glass roof panels. Station Master Harold Beckett stood on Platform 12, clipboard in hand, watching passengers disembark, factory workers heading home, soldiers on leave, mothers clutching children's hands. The routine of it felt surreal. Above, the sky had turned copper orange, and he could hear it before he saw the distant drone of engines that didn't belong to any British aircraft. He looked up through the soot-stained glass. Shadow formations were banking eastward toward the docks. Dornier bombers, maybe 50 of them, their black crosses just visible against the dying light. In 6 hours, when those bombers returned, the station would be unrecognizable. But in that frozen moment, staring at the painted steel girders above him, Harold understood something that would change everything about Britain's railway defense. The Germans could see too much from too high. Every rail line, every junction, every marshalling yard, they were all visible. Geometric patterns etched across the landscape like arrows pointing straight to Britain's industrial heart. Before we continue, Harold's story and how Britain made its entire railway network vanish, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We bring you untold World War II stories, the innovations, the sacrifices, the moments of brilliance. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support keeps history alive. That night, as the first bombs fell on London's East End, Harold Beckett realized that Britain's railway network wasn't just vulnerable, it was broadcasting its own destruction. And in that revelation lay the beginning of one of the war's most ingenious defensive operations: the complete camouflage transformation of 20,000 miles of British railways. The scale of the problem was staggering. Britain's railway network was the circulatory system of the nation's war effort. For major companies, the Great Western Railway, the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, and the Southern Railway had been unified under government control through the Railway Executive Committee on September 1, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland. Together, they operated 20,000 miles of track, 20,000 locomotives, and 1.2 million freight wagons. In 1939 alone, British Railways moved 254 million tons of freight. By 1940, that number had jumped to 288 million tons as war production accelerated. Every day, the railways carried ammunition from factories to ports, coal from mines to power stations, troops from training camps to embarkation points, and food from farms to cities. The network was operating at 140% of its peacetime capacity. Workers were pulling double shifts. Trains ran through the night with dimmed lights. The system was already stretched to breaking point, and now the Luftwaffe was targeting it with methodical precision from 15,000 feet. Luftwaffe reconnaissance crews could photograph entire regions with Zeiss cameras that captured details down to individual railway carriages. The photographs were developed in mobile darkrooms, analyzed by intelligence officers, and distributed to bomber squadrons within hours. Railway stations appeared as perfect geometric shapes: rectangles, parallel lines, the unmistakable patterns of platforms and tracks. Marshalling yards showed up as vast spiderwebs of intersecting rails. Locomotive sheds produced distinctive shadows. Signal boxes stood out like watchtowers. The railways were the most visible targets in Britain. The bombing began in earnest during the Blitz, between September 1940 and May 1941. German bombers would drop more than 41,000 tons of bombs on British cities. Railways were primary targets. Waterloo Station was hit repeatedly. Bombs struck Victoria Station, King's Cross, St. Pancras, Paddington. In one attack on September 15, 1940, a single bomb hit a crowded platform at Marble Arch Underground Station, killing 20 people. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where to aim. But even as the bombs fell, a solution was taking shape in an unlikely place: the studios and art schools of Britain. In early 1940, the government had established the Civil Defense Camouflage Directorate, headquartered in Leamington Spa. The organization recruited not soldiers or engineers, but creative professionals: painters, sculptors, theater set designers, architects, landscape artists. By mid-1940, all but 4 of the 65 camouflage officers were professional artists. The logic was unconventional but sound. These were people who understood light, shadow, perspective, and visual deception. A theater designer knew how to make a flat, painted backdrop look three-dimensional from the audience. A sculptor understood form and negative space. A landscape painter could analyze how colors changed with distance and atmospheric haze. These skills, it turned out, were exactly what was needed to fool reconnaissance cameras and bomber crews operating at high altitude. Colonel John Turner, a retired Royal Engineers officer, led the deception program. Turner had pioneered the use of decoys and dummy installations, fake airfields, that drew German bombs away from real targets. His operation, codenamed Q-Sights, had already saved countless lives by creating elaborate fakes that looked real from the air. Now he turned his attention to the opposite problem: making real railways look fake, damaged, or simply invisible. The camoufleurs approached railway stations like hostile canvases. Traditional military camouflage worked by blending objects into their surroundings, green and brown patterns that merged with forests and fields. But railways couldn't hide. They were permanent structures following predictable routes, so the artists didn't try to conceal them. They tried to confuse them. The technique was called disruptive pattern painting, and it transformed the visual logic of railway architecture. Starting in October 1940, teams of workers arrived at stations across southern England, carrying buckets of paint in colors that seemed deliberately wrong: dark earth brown, olive green, slate gray, deep black, and occasionally a dusty ochre. The colors weren't meant to match anything. They were meant to break up shapes. At Clapham Junction, one of Britain's busiest rail intersections, handling over 2,000 train movements daily, painters climbed onto rooftops and began applying irregular, angular patterns. Long rectangular roofs were divided into jagged segments of contrasting colors. The straight edges that made stations so recognizable from altitude were interrupted by painted shapes that suggested bomb damage, vegetation, or simply visual chaos. From ground level, the patterns looked bizarre, almost random. From 15,000 feet through a reconnaissance camera, they made the station's outline dissolve into visual noise. Signal boxes received special treatment. These distinctive structures, small elevated buildings with large windows, were perfect navigation markers for German bombers. The camoufleurs painted them with mottled patterns that made their edges blur. Shadows were painted on the sunny side, highlights on the shadowed side, inverting the natural play of light. The effect was disorienting. The eye couldn't quite focus on where the building began and ended. Platform surfaces presented another challenge. The long, straight, parallel lines of platforms were like arrows pointing to the station heart. Workers painted irregular dark patches across platforms, creating false shadows that suggested rubble or gaps. Some platforms were partially covered with camouflage netting course material painted to look like grass or dirt from above. The netting was suspended on wooden frames, creating actual shadows beneath it that added depth to the deception. The Southern Railway, controlling the vital corridor from Portsmouth to London, took camouflage to another level entirely. At Southampton's Central Station, engineers constructed false buildings' wooden frames covered with painted canvas, positioned 30 to 40 yards from real structures. These decoys mimicked locomotive sheds and freight depots. They even included fake damage, with painted holes in roofs and canvas debris scattered around them. When German bombers attacked Southampton in November 1940, many of their bombs struck these decoys. The real buildings stood untouched, still operational, still moving the equipment and troops that would eventually invade Normandy. Glass roof panels presented a unique problem. Many Victorian-era stations had been built with extensive glass roofing to allow natural light. These glass panels reflected sunlight, creating bright flashes that were visible from miles away. Removing the glass wasn't an option. Workers needed the light, and replacement glass was impossible to obtain during wartime. Instead, camoufleurs applied irregular patterns of dark paint to the undersides of glass panels. The patterns allowed some light through while breaking up the reflective surface. From altitude, the roofs appeared damaged or covered, not worth targeting. But visual camouflage was only part of the solution. Britain's railways ran continuously during the Blitz, moving troops and supplies under cover of darkness. The problem was that locomotives were essentially mobile bonfires. The firebox glow from coal-burning engines was visible from miles away. Steam vents glowed white in the darkness. Signal lights created points of brightness that German bomber crews used for navigation. Railway workers developed ingenious solutions through trial and error. Metal shrouds were fitted around locomotive fireboxes containing the glow. The shrouds had to allow enough airflow to keep the fire burning hot while blocking the light from being visible above. Engineers tested dozens of designs before finding one that worked. Steam vents were fitted with baffles that dispersed the steam downward instead of upward, making it less visible against the night sky. Signal lights underwent complete redesign. The bright red, yellow, and green lights that controlled train movements were essential for safety, but were like beacons for German bombers. Railway engineers painted signal lamps with non-reflective black paint and fitted them with directional hoods. The hoods focused the lights strictly along the track, making it visible to train drivers but invisible from above. Station lights were extinguished entirely and replaced with dim blue bulbs that provided just enough illumination for workers to navigate platforms but were nearly invisible from altitude. Arthur Webb, a signalman at Reading Station, kept a diary throughout this period. His entries captured the surreal reality of working on camouflaged railways. October 14, 1940, he wrote, "The station looks like a madman's painting. Dark greens and browns splashed everywhere. Nothing makes sense up close. Went up on the roof today to check the pattern from above, could barely tell where the platform ended and the goods yard began. If I can't see it from 30 feet up, Jerry's going to have a devil of a time finding us from 3 miles. He was right." By December 1940, German bombing accuracy against railways had decreased noticeably. Luftwaffe after-action reports showed increasing frustration. Pilots reported difficulty identifying targets. Bomber crews dropped their payloads on what they thought were railway targets, only to have reconnaissance photos show bombs falling on fields, empty lots, or decoy structures. The elaborate camouflage schemes were working. The human cost of maintaining the railways was staggering. Railway workers became frontline defenders, not with rifles, but with paintbrushes, sandbags, fire hoses, and an extraordinary dedication to keeping trains running. When bombs did hit land, thousands did repair crews work through the night to restore damaged track. The standard procedure was brutal. Assess damage while bombs were still falling. Bring in repair equipment before dawn. Have trains running again before the next nightfall. At Coventry, on November 14, 1940, German bombers dropped 500 tons of high explosives and 30,000 incendiary devices on the city. 568 people died. The railway station was hit repeatedly. But railway workers, many of them volunteers from surrounding areas, cleared wreckage while fires still burned around them. Twisted rails were cut away with torches. New track was laid by hand. Emergency signals were set up. 48 hours after the attack, trains were running through Coventry again. The transformation of Britain's railway network was total. By early 1941, the system had become a phantom. German reconnaissance photos showed stations that appeared abandoned, tracks that seemed to lead nowhere, marshalling yards that looked like bomb-damaged ruins or empty fields. The Luftwaffe still bombed railways. They dropped thousands of tons of explosives throughout 1941. and beyond, but their accuracy had plummeted. Instead of striking vital junctions and operational depots, bombs fell on painted decoys, camouflaged structures that were actually operational but appeared destroyed, and increasingly on empty land where intelligence photos suggested railways should be. The success of railway camouflage became a blueprint for defending other infrastructure. Factories received disruptive pattern treatment. The Supermarine Works in Southampton, where Spitfires were built, was painted to look like a residential neighborhood from above, complete with false streets and gardens painted on rooftops. Docks were disguised as parkland using camouflage netting painted green. Oil refineries disappeared beneath elaborate schemes of painted canvas and netting that suggested agricultural land. Britain was systematically repainting itself into invisibility. But the railway camouflage program faced its ultimate test in the spring of 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, required the largest movement of troops, vehicles, and equipment in human history. Southern England became a vast military staging ground. American, Canadian, and British forces were concentrated in camps across the region. Railways carried Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and ultimately, the invasion forces themselves to embarkation ports. The network operated at maximum capacity. In April 1944 alone, British Railways moved more than 400,000 troops. Thousands of freight trains carried invasion equipment southward. The pressure was immense. Every junction, every marshalling yard, every station along the southern coast was working around the clock. And the Germans knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where or when. Their reconnaissance aircraft flew constantly over southern England, photographing everything, searching for the telltale concentration of forces that would reveal the invasion target. The camoufleurs worked overtime during this period. Every station along the southern coast received fresh camouflage treatments. New decoys were built in fields near real stations, drawing German attention away from actual operations. Entire rail yards were covered with camouflage netting painted to resemble fields when viewed from above. At night, the strict light discipline was enforced with almost fanatical intensity. A single uncovered locomotive firebox could reveal a major troop concentration. Southampton presented the greatest challenge. The Southern Railway owned and operated the docks there, making them part of the railway system. Southampton docks became the primary embarkation point for American forces heading to Utah Beach. Between April and June 1944, more than 200,000 American troops passed through Southampton. German reconnaissance flights passed overhead repeatedly in May 1944, photographing the port. The photographs showed what appeared to be normal civilian railway operations, with a few camouflaged warehouses that looked damaged. The Germans had no idea that beneath the camouflage and cover of darkness, the largest invasion force ever assembled was boarding trains and moving to ships. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The German response was confused and delayed. Part of that confusion stemmed from intelligence failures rooted in the success of British camouflage. The Germans had systematically underestimated the capacity of Britain's rail network because they couldn't see it functioning. Their reconnaissance photos showed damaged stations, disrupted rail lines, and limited activity. They didn't realize that southern England's railways had moved an entire army to the coast, in plain sight, hidden by paint and canvas and the brilliant deception of artists who understood how to make visibility into invisibility. The final irony came in the months after D-Day, as Allied forces advanced through France and into Germany. They discovered German railway operations suffering catastrophic losses under constant air attack. The Germans had never developed effective railway camouflage. Their stations stood out clearly. Our marshalling yards were perfectly visible. Allied fighter bombers attacked German railways with devastating precision, crippling logistics and hastening Germany's defeat. Every lesson Britain had learned about hiding railways from aerial attack was now being used to destroy German railways. In the war's final year, British railway workers looked at their camouflaged stations with exhausted pride. The paint was fading now, weathered by 3 years of rain and soot. The decoys showed their age, but the railways still ran. They had carried Britain through the Blitz, through the V1 and V2 rocket attacks, through the massive buildup to D-Day, and through to victory. Arthur Webb, the signalman from Reading, survived the war. His final diary entry, dated May 8, 1945 day, reflected on what the camouflage had meant. "We painted our way through the war," he wrote. "Sounds daft when you say it out loud, but those mad patterns, those ugly colors that made no sense up close, they saved lives. Every train that reached its destination, every soldier who made it to the coast, every ton of supplies that moved through, every bomb that fell on empty ground instead of a crowded platform, it all depended on making sure Jerry couldn't see what he was looking for. We didn't fight with guns, we fought with paintbrushes, and we won." The camouflage schemes were dismantled after the war. Stations were repainted in their traditional company colors, the chocolate and cream of the Great Western, the red of the Midland, the apple green of the Southern. The decoys were torn down, the netting removed, the false buildings demolished. But traces remained for decades. Even into the 1970s and 80s, patches of dark green or mottled brown could be found beneath layers of newer paint on Victorian signal boxes and station walls, ghostly reminders of when Britain's railways had to vanish to survive. The lesson wasn't about paint or deception techniques. It was about adaptation under impossible pressure. Faced with an enemy that could see everything from above, Britain didn't build underground railways or abandon the network. It changed how those railways appeared. It turned the most visible infrastructure into something bomber crews couldn't reliably identify. It transformed vulnerability into a kind of protection that saved countless lives and kept the nation moving through its darkest hours. The Germans had technological superiority in many areas: better reconnaissance cameras, higher flying aircraft, more accurate bombing techniques. But Britain had something more valuable: artists who understood that what you see from 15,000 feet isn't always the truth. They understood that reality is negotiable, that perception can be shaped, that a painted shadow can be more powerful than concrete and steel. In the end, Britain's trains didn't vanish through magic, but through mastery of perception camouflage, turning railways into operational ghosts. They proved that sometimes the best defense isn't armor or firepower, but making the enemy stare at something vital and see nothing at all.